Namaste. In this lecture, we shall explore invasive alien species as a modern threat. Our guiding question is this: how can a species introduced in a new place disrupt entire ecological systems? And this is an important question. By the end of the lecture, we will have a clear framework for understanding it. Here is the roadmap for today's session. We will begin with important definitions because clear language is essential to this topic. We will then examine how alien species are introduced into new places. After that, we will ask why only some introduced species become invasive. The second half of the lecture focuses on their ecological impacts, and we close by considering management options, the link to globalization, and why invasive species are a sustainability concern. Before we go further, we must establish three definitions carefully: native species, alien species, and invasive species. These terms are sometimes used loosely in everyday language, but in ecology, each one has a precise meaning. The image here, showing a landscape from Panna Tiger Reserve, is a useful reminder that core regions of protected areas are often good places to look for native species because they are relatively less modified and closer to natural ecological conditions. Keeping these definitions clear will help us think more accurately about them throughout the lecture. A native species is one that occurs naturally in a particular region. It is part of the long-term ecological community of that place. It has evolved with local environmental conditions and developed relationships with other native species over time. The image here shows Andaman bulletwood, which is native to the Andaman Islands, and it gives us a concrete example of what we mean by a species belonging to a place through ecological history rather than recent human introduction. An alien species, also called a non-native species, is one that has been moved outside its historical range. This movement may be deliberate, as in the case of eucalyptus, which is shown here and was introduced into India, or it may even be accidental through trade and transport. The key point is that an alien species is defined by where it comes from, not by whether it is automatically harmful. Many introduced species remain limited and do not become invasive. An invasive species is an alien species that does more than simply arrive. It establishes, it spreads, and it causes harm. The image here shows Lantana camara, a well-known invasive alien species, which helps us connect the definition to a real example. The harm may be ecological, economic, or social. But in biodiversity studies, the main concern is how such species spread and disrupt native natural ecosystems. This distinction is so important that it deserves its own slide. Not all alien species become invasive. Many introduced species fail to establish at all because local conditions do not suit them. Others survive in small numbers without ever becoming dominant or spreading widely. Only a very small subset spreads aggressively and causes clear harm. So invasion is a subset of introduction. It is not a synonym for it. When we study invasive species, we are studying that smaller but ecologically significant group, not every organism that has ever moved across a border. We spend time on these definitions because precise language leads to precise thinking. If we label every non-native species as invasive, we exaggerate the problem and may direct resources poorly. If we ignore harmful spread, we underreact and allow damage to accumulate. Good ecological management begins with clear categories. When we encounter an introduced species, the right questions are these: has it established? Is it spreading? Is it causing harm? And each question corresponds to a definition and each answer shapes the response. Now we move from definitions to pathways. How do alien species actually arrive in new places? The main routes are trade and transport, ornamental planting, accidental movement, ballast water, and pet release or escape. The image here showing an ornamental plant display sign fits well with one of the major pathways. Species are often introduced intentionally for gardening or for landscaping, and some later spread beyond the places where they were first planted. What these pathways share is that human activity moves species into regions where they did not occur naturally. Some introductions are fully intentional. Ornamental plants are brought in gardens for landscaping, and Lantana camara is a well-known example of that. Introduced in India as an ornamental plant before later spreading widely. Species may also be introduced into forestry and agriculture, released for biological control, or moved through the pet and aquarium trade. In each case, the original purpose is human use, but the ecological outcome may be very different from what was intended. Other introductions are entirely accidental. Organisms may travel hidden within goods, soil, packaging, cargo, or vehicles. And ports and transport corridors often become major entry points. The image here points to a serious consequence of such introductions. The brown tree snake, accidentally introduced to Guam, contributed to the extinction of the Guam flycatcher and drove the Guam kingfisher to extinct in the wild. This shows that even an unnoticed introduction can eventually produce very large ecological losses. Ballast water is particularly important pathway for aquatic invasions. Ballast water is the water that ships take in and store to maintain stability and balance during travel, especially when they are not carrying full cargo. Ships of different sizes, like the ones here, can therefore transport small aquatic organisms, larvae, eggs, and microorganisms from one region to another. When that water is released in a new port or coastal area, some of these organisms may survive and establish. This is why aquatic invasions are closely linked to transport systems and why early detection is often difficult. Pet release and escape represent another important pathway. A species kept in captivity may be released intentionally or may escape from homes, farms, or other facilities. The image here shows a rabbit on the Ross Island, which helps illustrate how even a small and familiar animal, once outside controlled conditions, can survive in a new place and become part of the local ecological system, in this case of the Andamans. If the environment is suitable, such species may breed, spread, and eventually create wider ecological problems. Now we come to an important question. Why do some alien species become invasive while others do not? Traits that often help include high reproduction, rapid spread, fewer natural enemies in the new range, tolerance of disturbed conditions, and strong competition for resources. Not every invasive species has all of these traits, but many have enough of them to establish and spread successfully. High reproduction and rapid spread help an introduced species grow and expand quickly. A small population can become large in a short period of time, sometimes before managers even notice it. And this gives the invader an advantage in the early stages of establishment. When a species enters a new range, it may no longer face the same predators, parasites, or pathogens that had kept its population in check in its own native habitat. With fewer of these natural controls, it may establish more quickly, grow more quickly, and spread more widely. This release from natural enemies is one reason why some introduced species become invasive. Many invasive species do especially well in disturbed environments, where native communities may already be weakened and under stress. Open space, reduced competition, and human modified conditions can make establishment of invasive species much easier. And this is why habitat disturbance often creates opportunities for invasion. Disturbance often opens the way for invasion. The image here shows clearing for a road, and roadsides are often very good places for species like lantana to establish because they receive abundant sunlight that a closed canopy would normally block. In any case, we can see that the vegetation near the roads is very different from what we find inside the forests. When native vegetation is disturbed and the ecological space opens up, invasive species may find it easier to enter, grow, and spread. We now turn to the ecological impacts of invasive species. These impacts often appear through competition, predation, disease spread, hybridization, and broader ecosystem change. And together, they can reduce native biodiversity and also alter how ecosystems function. Competition is one of the more common impacts of invasive species. The image here shows lantana removal in Mudumalai Tiger Reserve. The brown stacks are uprooted lantana, and the cleared area becomes available again for the native fauna, including the deer that are seen in this picture. This helps us to see how invasive plants can occupy space and resources that native species would otherwise use. Predation from invasive species becomes especially serious when native species face a new threat that they are not adapted to handle. The image here shows Sarus cranes in Bharatpur, where wetlands have now become dominated by African catfish that have escaped into the system and pose a threat to birds and their eggs. This helps show how an introduced predator can disrupt food webs and place additional pressures on native wildlife. Disease is another important way for invasive species to cause harm. The example here is the invasive American bullfrog, which can spread chytrid fungus to native amphibians while showing little or no serious symptoms itself. In this way, an invasive species may act as a carrier of diseases and increase pressure on already vulnerable native populations. Hybridization adds a different kind of impact. Here, domestic cats have bred with the Scottish wildcat. So, in many places, the wildcat now survives not as a fully pure form but as a hybridized form. We may recall that species are often defined by reproductive isolation, but in nature, that isolation is not always complete. Biology is the science of exceptions, and this is especially true between closely related species. And this is why hybridization can sometimes occur and why it can threaten the genetic identity of native species. Some invasive species affect ecosystems at a broader level by changing how they function. Fire regimes may change, and the dense vegetation shown here can become a strong source of fuel during the summer season. Soil and nutrient processes may change. Water systems may be altered, and habitat structure may be transformed. This means that the impact of invasion can extend well beyond individual species to the ecosystem as a whole. Invasions can also simplify ecological communities by reducing native diversity and allowing a few dominant species to expand. Ecological roles may be lost. So we had talked about functional variety, and functional varieties may be lost. And resilience may also weaken. The image here shows a cat in Manas Tiger Reserve. Cats are well-known extinction agents that can heavily reduce bird populations. Invasive plants such as lantana shown here can form dense growth that excludes native vegetation. Light, water, and nutrient access may change. Regeneration of native species may decline, and habitat conditions may shift. And this is how an invasive plant can gradually alter an entire local community. The image here shows a catfish. This invasive species, the African catfish, was introduced to support fisheries and aquaculture in Rajasthan. But it later escaped from the tanks and it reached Bharatpur, a bird sanctuary. Once established in the wetlands, it began threatening native biodiversity, showing how a species introduced for economic purposes can create serious ecological problems. The image here shows a ship, reminding us how aquatic systems allow rapid spread through transport pathways such as ballast water. A well-known example is the spread of mussels through ballast water carried by ships from one region to another. Such invaders may alter food webs or water conditions, and management is often very difficult once they have established. And that is why prevention becomes especially important in aquatic systems. This slide reminds us that invasion is not a single event, but a sequence that develops over time. A species may first be introduced for forestry, ornamental planting, or for dune stabilization, and then it may establish in the new area, spread beyond the original site, and gradually begin to outcompete the native plants. As the example here suggests, invasive plants can also increase fire risk, alter habitat conditions, and place pressure on local biodiversity. So the real ecological problem often appears step by step, not all at once. In this particular example, the invasive Manitoka and Ruicrans were brought in from Australia for a certain purpose, but then later on they became invasive. The process of invasion leads directly to the importance of early detection. A small, newly established population is manageable. A widespread, well-established invasion is a difficult, different, and a much harder problem. The cost of management typically rises with time, and the ecological damage continues during any delay. Early detection systems, monitoring programs, and rapid response protocols are therefore among the most important investments a management system can make. Acting early is almost always more efficient than acting late, both in ecological terms as well as in economic terms. Management options for invasive species can be grouped broadly. Prevention is the first and the most efficient priority. It includes biosecurity measures, inspection of trade goods, quarantine, and public awareness. If a species has arrived, rapid response at the earliest stage is the next priority. If the species is already established, managers may attempt containment to limit further spread of the species, control to reduce its abundance, or eradication where it is technically and practically feasible. But not all invasions can be fully reversed. That is a hard reality of invasion biology. But a systematic management framework, beginning with prevention and moving towards response, greatly improves the outcomes. This principle deserves to be stated directly. Prevention is almost always more cost effective than attempting to manage an invasion after it has become widespread. Once an invasive species has spread extensively, ecological damage may continue during control efforts. Complete removal may sometimes be impossible. Resources are limited, and spending them on controlling an entrenched invasion means spending less on the prevention of future ones. Reducing entry pathways, strengthening biosecurity at borders and ports as seen in this image, and managing the conditions that make ecosystems vulnerable are the most efficient long-term investments in protecting biodiversity from invasive species. Invasive species are also closely linked to globalization. The airport shown here is a useful reminder that trade and travel increase movement opportunities for us as well as for invasive species across regions. This connectivity brings ecological risk as well as economic benefit, and modern invasion pressure is largely human driven. For that reason, biodiversity management must work across borders as well. The link between invasive species and sustainability is direct. Invasive species can reduce biodiversity and degrade the ecosystem services that human communities depend on, including clean water, pollination, productive soils, and fisheries. Agriculture may be affected through competition from invasive weeds or by the spread of invasive pests. Management costs can be very high. Communities that depend on natural resources may find those resources significantly reduced. Preventing and managing invasive species is therefore not only a conservation goal, it is also a sustainability goal, aligned with protecting the ecological foundations on which long-term human well-being rests. At this point in the course, we should look back at this week. The threats we have examined do not operate independently. Disturbance can open communities to invasion. Overuse can weaken native populations that would otherwise resist introduced competitors or predators. Fragmentation can isolate communities and reduce their ability to recover from any additional stress, including that of the invasive species. Real biodiversity decline is almost always cumulative. Single threats are serious, but combined threats are often far more damaging. Holding that connected view is one of the key analytical skills this course asks you to develop. Before we move towards closing, let us review the key terms from this lecture. Native species occur naturally in a region through ecological history. Alien species have been moved outside their historical range, whether naturally, intentionally, or accidentally. Invasive species are those alien species that establish, spread, and cause harm. Establishment means a species surviving and reproducing in the new area. Spread means it expands beyond the initial point of introduction. Eradication means complete removal of the species from the new range, which is often very difficult once a species is widespread and entrenched. As you prepare to revise this lecture, there are 4 orientations to keep in mind. First, you should be able to define the concept of invasive alien species clearly, including the distinction between native, alien, and invasive. Second, you should be able to distinguish this topic from related ideas and common misunderstandings, such as the assumption that all non-native species are harmful. Third, you should be able to explain the main mechanisms that we discussed today: pathways of introduction, traits that favor invasion, and ecological impacts, including competition, predation, disease, hybridization, and ecosystem change. Fourth, you should be able to apply these ideas to biodiversity conservation, sustainability policy, or real-world management decisions. In the next lecture, we will turn to pollution as a form of ecological stress. We will examine how contaminants and waste affect organisms and ecosystems. That lecture will complete week 3 and carry forward the pattern we have been building, understanding the major human-driven threats to biodiversity and how they interact with one another. Before we close, consider this reflection question. How can the ideas discussed in this lecture about invasive alien species help us understand or solve a real sustainability challenge? You may think about this in terms of a local ecosystem you are familiar with, a policy question around trade and biosecurity, the livelihoods of communities that depend on fisheries or agriculture, or the broader challenge of managing ecological risk in an increasingly connected world. Good reflection connects the concepts of this lecture to real situations where the ideas can inform decisions. And that is all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.